Hi, and welcome to the Existential Coach. On today's episode, I want to do something a little different. I want to talk about two things and then see how or if they can link up in any way. So, on the one hand, on the one side of things, I want to talk about voting. And I'm located in Toronto, in Ontario, and there's a provincial election that's coming up on June 2nd. On the other hand, I want to talk about bullying and the way in which bullying has, well, to start off with, become a bit more of a discussed topic. Yet at the same time, we are able to recognize that the way in which bullying is normalized in our culture, being definitive and in control and decisive and a decider and taking your future kind of by the scruff of the neck, and all of these kinds of things have helped infuse this culture of bullying in a manner that justifies a lot of the injustice that goes on in our relationships. And that leads to frustration. That leads to a sense of alienation. And this will link up with this idea of voting and the question that I hear people pose when they get to a point of being frustrated, when they say, is there really any point in voting? So here we already see how there are bullying tactics that go on that stop us from engaging in this case, the political process. But more broadly, what are we saying when we step away from the political process and say, they're all lying, they're going to lie anyway, or they're not going to do this, or they're not going to do that, so what does it matter? Well, on some level, we're hurt. Naturally, we feel frustrated. We've had hopes for things. We want things to be more stable. There's these promises given in the same way that any kind of marketing scheme has a promise of, filling the gap in your life with the product X. Here too, there's filling the gap in your life with platform X. And it's pretty obvious the way in which rhetoric is used, in the same way that in marketing and branding, exploitation is used to, create a weakness that it can then answer the crisis created by that weakness. So what that means is we're told kind of what our problem is, what's wrong with us, and we're put into a situation due to circumstance. Maybe it's the money we're making, the place that we're living, the health condition that we have, our marital status, all of these different things. We're told, okay, well, that situation that you're in that is creating this anxiety, here is the answer. Now, that creates this kind of codependent relationship. And when that builds up, when we're, have so many things that we're trying to deal with, and when I talk to people, a common theme is their cup is just full. So as a bit of an aside, one of the things that can happen in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is not something I'm really involved in, but one of the things that happens, they can say, well, we're going to, between 1 and 10, what's your anxiety? And when I've been in groups and witnessed these things, I've never had somebody, say, 0 or 2 or 3 or anything under 5. And in large part, it's because we've normalized anxiety at such a high level that it is, in effect, just this new norm. And without acknowledging that we've created an environment that has so much going on that it creates a kind of anxiety, a stress, a strain. And from that, our responses tend to move towards bullying. Right? Tend to move towards binary ways of thinking. You're with us or you're against us. It's right or wrong. Or why can't people just understand? Or why can't you just do this? Why can't you just do that? But what's happened in this process is we've shifted to a kind of helplessness, and our response is to bully our way out. Now, somebody might be thinking, okay, well, you're really stretching what the term bully means here. If a kid in school has been shamed and hurts themselves or commits suicide because of this shaming, certainly that's different. And certainly it is different on a level where this person is injured or taken their own life. The question I'm asking, the question I'm positing is, how did we get to that point? How do we create a society where that is something that is increasingly happening? Well, and I think the obvious answer is it's because it's normal. The thing that's not normal is that at a certain point, bullying is reflected back to us and it shocks us. And in that moment, and this is really essential here, in that moment, we realize profoundly that we are complicit in a way of being in the world that can lead to, in the case of the person who injures or takes their own life, that leads to a person destroying themselves. And there is a shame that comes with that. And we are exposed. We are caught. It's referred to as the gaze. We are caught in this realization that, oh my gosh, I'm in this situation where I have these kinds of manipulative, controlling, binary behaviors and responses. And I've constructed my world to deal with being overwhelmed in a manner that says it's okay, even not necessarily even okay, that it's essential, right? To in order to succeed, I need to be like this. And yet, on some level, I am aware that I am complicit in this way of being in the world that is so alienating that it leads to a person, in this case, in this example, taking their own life. So, stepping back from this and thinking, well, how does that relate to voting? And as I mentioned, there's this point that I hear people get to. They say, well, what's the point? I don't think I'm going to vote this time, or I'm going to vote this way, or, in effect saying I'm going to kind of throw my vote away. It just doesn't really matter. And if you imagine somebody who's really, really frustrated, who feels that they have no capacity to change their situation, that they are helpless, right? There's a structure in place that means their idea of how we're going to be in the world is just not relevant. Is that not a form of bullying? Is that not the experience of having your subjectivity negated? Therefore, is that not narcissism? After all, a narcissist is somebody who negates the subjectivity of somebody else, who just doesn't allow it to have space, referred to as gaslighting. And so, if a person experiences themselves and their thoughts and their ideas and all of these different things, yet there is no place for that to go, they cannot exist in the world by saying, these are my beliefs and I want to find a way to do whatever it is that my beliefs, however they're functioning to help me understand my way of being in the world, then we shut that person down. Well, again, is that not bullying? What I've noticed when I talk to people about bullying and when I talk to people about voting is there isn't a connection made between the way in which society operationalizes the structures that create the system necessary to bully. You bully because you've learned in some way, through experience and other ways, that negating somebody else's subjectivity is something that is a part of our society. That listening is something that is actually not necessary in our society. You learn that rhetoric has more value than reason. You learn that the way in which we control people is more important than the way in which we connect with people. And this speaks to a larger issue of the way in which we all exist in the world, which is to say, how are we understanding the interconnectedness of us and all things on planet Earth? And I think it's pretty fair to say not particularly well. I think the disconnect that goes on as we think about the environment, it's not really possible for us to understand that the system we have in place for how we understand our structures of identity, which includes the way in which we bully and manipulate and control one another, are incompatible with existence, certainly in the long term. Yet, we cannot step out of that way of being in the world because we would lose who and how we think we are. So, I'm going to make another connection here that strikes me when a person says, I'm not going to vote because there's no point in voting. Is it in some way their protest? Is it in some way them saying, I just want to say no. I just want to say that's wrong. I just want to have something I do matter. And, clearly we've been talking about the dimension of alienation and isolation that goes on, certainly an existential tenet, but now we can get into the way in which meaning is such an instrumental part of our existence. And to have a view of the way in which people connect, and to see time and time again that bullying and manipulation is really the ideal that we in society hold up as being the good, and that we don't really value the voices that seem to challenge the way in which we can be in the world in a more connected way, which is to say that step beyond this specific understanding of controlling, of colonizing, of tyrannizing our environments into an intersubjective experience of relating, because we are in a state of fear, of anxiety. And that goes back to that notion I was saying of, if everybody is essentially at a state where their cup, so to speak, is overflowing, then they're not in a state where they can reflect on other people's views, different points of view, and so on. Instead, they present their phalanx of this is what it is, and you're either with us or against us. So why is this so important? Well, as we're starting to talk about bullying, and really we should be talking about it in the context of not bullying per se, but violence on the part of one individual or a group of individuals to another or another group, we start to realize that we're talking about some form of conflict, some form of war, some form of aggression that does not allow the existence of other opinions to have space, right? And so but why is this so important to us? Why is this so essential to the way in which we understand ourselves in the world? Well, again, going back to this idea of anxiety and stress and being overwhelmed, if all of this stuff out there, all of the things that are going on are so confusing and we can't change the world and there's no point in voting, and we don't call it violence, we call it bullying. In other words, we kind of minimize the effect of these kinds of relationships, even though they end in some cases, suicide, or in some cases, murder. So we minimize the extent to which this conflict impacts our lives and impacts the way in which we see ourselves in the world. Even so, we cannot see stepping past that. In other words, we can't see ourselves as being connected because we are in such an anxious state. And if we're in this anxious state, then finding some simplistic way to answer everything, whether it's through holding onto a very specific political party, a very specific religious belief, whether doesn't really matter what it is, but there's some way that this is the one thing I'm drilling down on because I can't control anything. Nobody's listening to me. Nobody's listening to anybody else. So as a result, what I need to do is just really hold on to this one view. And of course, you see extremists that really exemplify this very act, right? Which is to say, all things are the problem with culture X, so we're going to do this thing to teach them or to be different or to whatever it is. Now, is that not bullying? Right? Is that not the experience of saying, okay, everything in the world is a mess. We're not moral, we're not respectful, we're not any number of things. And certainly all of these things can be easily argued, and I think quite aptly. So therefore, because it's kind of this mess, I'm going to drill down on this view and take a radicalized view, an extremist view. And of course, that's by degree. But what that means is now I have the right to bully, right? I have the right to control, manipulate, gaslight. And so as a bit of a digression, we hear this rhetoric surrounding the invasion of Ukraine and the way in which this was a freedom mission on the part of really Putin and Putin's Russia, you could say, to quote unquote liberate. Of course, as a Canadian looking at this that's incoherent. But what makes sense for him and his ideology is he's not a bully, right? He's not a tyrant. He's a liberator. And I think if we start to understand that the environment that creates such conflict, in other words, the way in which we divide things up and then add anxiety and stress, and as I say, the cup being overflowed to that, then we're less able to delineate, okay, well, wait a second. What's actually going on here? What are we actually talking about? So I think, one way to look at this and one way to start considering this is say, oh, well, at what point am I kind of triggered, right? At what point am I feel like, okay, well, I'm not going to vote. And I'm not saying people should or shouldn't vote. This is not, about voting or not voting. It is about, however, understanding and questioning that process and asking, is there a form of bullying going on here? Have my expectations been raised to such an extent that if my vote won't have whatever I decide is the amount of effect it needs to have, then I just won't bother, and that'll be my protest. That'll be my rebellion. Yet, who does that benefit? It benefits the bully. Silence always benefits the bully. And whether it's fighting back to the bully themselves, or whether it's saying, okay, I'm going to do other things, talk to other people, organize whatever I'm going to do a podcast like I'm doing right now, whatever it is, and it can be very small. One person might listen to this. No people might listen to this. But even so, this is what I can do. I can't guarantee the results. In other words, I can say, by analogy, well, because, let's say I want, a certain number of people to listen to this podcast. And every week I look at the numbers and I say, it's not meeting that criteria. So I have two options. I can try and find topics or things that I think may be more topical, more controversial, or kind of clickbait in a way that get people to click. So I can say, oh, well, that way I can get listeners. Or I can say, you know what, I'm just not going to do this podcast because I'm not getting enough listeners. So there's clearly no point. So my podcast, in a sense, becomes my vote, right? And I'm saying there's no point in me even doing this podcast, i.e. there's no point in me voting. There's no point in me engaging because nothing's going to happen. I'm going to do the podcast. The world's going to keep on being the world. Nothing's going to change. So I guess there's no point in doing this. So in a similar way, this form of inaction is bred into what's going on in our lives, and we normalize it, which means we are being bullied to such an extent that we accept that there's nothing that can be done, and then say, therefore, there is no reason to do anything because there is nothing that can be done. And we have evidence, right? Our experience has taught us how ineffective it is to vote or to do a podcast or whatever it is. So we then think, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to structure my life in a way to protect myself against not being realized or actualized or heard. And I'm going to create some kind of little bubble. Maybe I'm going to hang out with certain people or believe certain things, develop a certain fanatical belief about, well, this is the absolute truth. And so people don't know it, but I do. Conspiracy theory certainly moves into that realm where the idea is somebody saying, I understand how the world works and you don't, too bad for you. All of this, in a way, creates this kind of power within a person, this kind of strength within a person. But of course, it's all because of bullying, right? It's all because there is this imbalance between the way in which we exist in the world, the way in which we are in a situation where we are exploited, where we are alienated, where our cup is overflowing. All of these things are happening, and we don't know what to do. We're not necessarily connecting with people. We're feeling disconnected. We're feeling afraid, anxious, all of the rest of it. So it's natural that we would hit points of frustration. So here's kind of what I'm wondering is, what can we do when we hit these points of frustration to not pull away and say, because my vote, because my podcast is not having the effect and effect that I want, I'm just going to give up. How do we keep ourselves going in the midst of uncertainty, in spite of uncertainty? How do we, and this is another existential idea, how do we get into this place of being with unknowing, uncertainty, the absence of structure, and saying, okay, well, I'm just trusting that there is something to life that is beyond what I necessarily understand and see in terms of the objective relationships, but there's something to putting things out there, whether it's a vote, whether it's a podcast, regardless of what it is, that there is something kind of radically fundamental to engaging the experience without creating any expectation of getting anything back. This is what Kierkegaard refers to as a leap of faith, right? That although he was religious, this is not really a religious idea per se. This is the idea that somebody has a concrete notion of the way the world is, which can be religious. There is a God, there is a this, there is a that, there is what doesn't matter what it is. They have a concrete notion of the way it is. Yet, that awareness has been challenged. And so they experience a paradox that, for example, if we're good, then the world should be good, but it's not. Hence paradox. So how do you exist if what you want, the cyclical relationship you want out of your connections to people and making the world a better place, whatever it is, are constantly interrupted? Well, the leap of faith is saying that there's some other reason, there's some other thing going on here that I do not understand. But I trust that this form of putting it out there, and I want to make one distinction here that I think is kind of vital. Because, of course, on one level, you can have people putting it out there in a very dogmatic way, and they then try to, like I said, negate people's, or like the narcissist, negate people's subjectivity or gaslight or invade, in the case of Putin. So you have somebody who is overwhelming, who is, it's tyranny, right? It's this idea of oppression that is structured in a way where I'm just going to destroy the other person. This is obviously not what I'm talking about, or hope is obviously. What I'm talking about is doing something without the expectation of a result, right? So with the Putin example, he has an expectation that he is a liberator, right? He has constructed in his mind this myth that he is uniting. It doesn't really matter, but he's got this idea in his mind, whatever it is, and that he is in some way the good in that vision, but it involves destroying other people. Kierkegaard and the idea of the leap of faith is you are believing in connections in spite of your own hubris, in spite of your own arrogance, in spite of your own, all of these different things that lead us to think that we can control, dominate, and so on. So if we jump back to this notion of voting not mattering, and again, this is not a ad for Vote, Canada, but what this is saying is the reason we do it or don't, is it because we're hurt that the kind of world we live in is not being manifest? If it is, does that not voting actually get us to the place we want? If it does not, how many times do we do things that do not get to the place we want to go to, right? In other words, it's just not a great argument, right? If you say, well, I drink because my life is shitty, and then you drink, and I say, is your life better? And you say, no. Well, then clearly it's not the result that you want. It might be the only option you have. It might be the only way you think you can do anything, but you're not getting the result you actually want. So the person says, well, I'm not voting, and now I'm getting a society I want. I'm getting the MP I want, or the MPP I want. I'm getting the policies I want, and so on and so forth. But they're not. And so if we're not going to get the things that we want by doing this, why are we doing this? Well, helplessness. We feel like there's just no point. That's the point at which we take the leap of faith. That's the point at which we say, in spite of not getting what I want, I'm going to keep on doing this thing I believe, making these connections and so on and so forth, because I believe in expanding. I believe in understanding. I believe in pluralism. I believe in diversity. I believe in equity and equality. I believe in these things so much that even though, in the spite of all of this stuff, all of these contradictions, in spite of being in a neoliberal system that is predicated upon exploitation, I will continue to, like I am here, make a podcast, even if there's no listeners, because this is what I can do, or it's one of the things I can do. And it's not that it will then result in saving and changing and doing all these things. It might be a part of it might be a grain of sand in a pile of sand that contributes to something. It might have some secondary effect or even further removed. Somebody might hear about this podcast and hear about something that was said. I might even talk about the theme to somebody. Literally, I could meet somebody and say, hey, I did a podcast and, I'd been looking at a bunch of different things and I was thinking about this idea of voting and why why people say, I'm not going to vote, who cares? And I was watching these other things about some work. There's an organization in Toronto called Yorktown Family Services, and a guy there was talking about bullying. And so all of these things kind of came together in my mind. And so I decided to do this podcast. They don't even listen to the podcast. They go, yeah, my son or daughter is bullied, or I was bullied. And they start thinking about that. And maybe they start thinking about things that they can do. So the point here is to say, if we hook ourselves up to a very specific method of being fed a reciprocal understanding of our identity through marketing, through rhetoric, through all of these different things that we are told, whether in political spheres or in marketing and economic spheres, then are we not kind of hooking ourselves up for a codependent relationship that negates our own experience of what and why it means and is important to us to express ourselves and do so in spite of the fact that we may not have the kind of global narcissistic effect that we want. In other words, that we take this leap of faith because. And, maybe that should be the theme of this show, is we take the leap of faith because. And again, it's not about negating anybody's subjectivity. It's not about gaslighting. It's not about tyranny and control and oppression. It's about if you have a belief and you want the vote to actually instrumentalize that belief to such an extent that it becomes real, and it doesn't, so you think I'm going to not vote. Couldn't another way of looking at this say, well, I'm going to vote, or not, again, this is not an Ontario Votes ad, but let's say I'm going to vote and I'm going to do these other things. And I'm going to keep on doing them, not because I think it's going to get to the result, but because this is actually who I am, and I choose to be that person. And this is a key part of, certainly Sartre talks about this, but the key tenet in existentialism that gets into responsibility. That you cannot control your environment. You cannot control your situation, circumstance. We're born into the world. We're born into a body, gender, color, skin, all these kinds of things, and age, a time, and so on. All of these things have happened, or it's referred to as thrown into the world. We've been thrown into the world. And so you could say I'm thrown into, I live in Ontario. Ontario is pretty conservative. So I'm a not conservative person who's thrown into this kind of conservative environment. So what do? Well, I trust that there's really beautiful tenets within the conservative frame. I trust that people want to connect. I trust that there are things that can happen in our lives that go beyond the fixed understanding of what I think somebody should do. And, interestingly enough, traditional conservatives want, they want job security, they want hospitals, they want arts and community centers, they want all these things. They just don't want a government 5,000 miles away telling them what they need. Now, what we're dealing with is something that very much goes against what I believe, which is I want to connect with people. I don't care if they live in a small town or a big town. I don't care about the color of their skin. I don't care if they... I just don't care about those distinctions. Why? Because I don't care about the distinctions that the bully tells me I need to care about. I don't care about the world that I'm told I'm supposed to revere when I think, no, the world I revere is a world of connection and connectedness. So, to kind of summarize here, I think there's something interesting to explore in how bullying and how we are bullied in ways that impact and influence the way in which we make decisions, including deciding to vote and deciding to not vote, or to make a podcast or to not make a podcast. So, for now, I'll just leave it there. As always, if you have any questions or any comments, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me at jordanoconnor.com. Okay, bye for now.